thank you for the invitation. I'm very glad to be able to share these results of this long research that I've been working on for the past 4 years or something like that. For sure, there was the pandemic, there was a maternity leave, and because of many different reasons, it took more time than planned. But we're finally starting to analyze the results. And actually what we're starting to see is that despite the culture of informality that prevails in the video game industry, its structures remain highly hierarchical, and not all employees can evenly express their opinion, or equally heard, or are granted the same creative freedom, or are given the same opportunities in the video game industry. So my research is originally called Diversity, Equality, and Inclusion in the Video Game Industry, but to better fit with the topic of the conference, today I decided to name my presentation Hierarchy, Discrimination, and Inequality in the Video Game Industry. Yes? Oh, I heard something. Is everything okay? Can you?
Everything is fine. So
okay.
Should work.
Sorry, I heard something. So just a quick word about the methodology. So I will present the results of a survey that was conducted among 1,500 employees from the Quebec gaming industry. Quebec is a French-speaking province of Canada, for those who don't know about it. These people are all working in development teams. So not in human resources, not in finance, but in development teams. And we also conducted 17 semi-structured interviews with people who encountered problems in relation to diversity, equality, and inclusion at the video game studios. We wanted to interview more people, but it has been a bit tricky, and we might try to make more interviews in the next months. So the objective of the survey was to provide a current picture of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the Quebec video game industry, just like the PhD student who spoke before me mentioned. We saw a lot in the media, those scandals about toxicity and sexual harassment in video game studios, big studios that are that make very popular games, but we didn't have this statistical portrait of the situation. So I was curious to make one for the Quebec video game industry. For sure, it cannot be generalized to other countries, but we can suppose that it could be similar in Austria or in France, where the culture is not that different. But the work has to be done in other countries as well. So we also wanted to identify the most prevalent issues with diversity, equity, and inclusion in this industry. So what are the main problems where we should focus our attention? And the interview's objective was to deepen our understanding of the phenomena. So trying to understand how DE problems manifest themselves in studios, really get concrete examples, and understand why such problems persist. So the composition of the sample, we actually had 63% of our respondents are men, 32% are women, and 5% are non-cisgender people. The non-cisgender category includes people who identify as non-binary, trans, and fluid, so everyone whose gender do not correspond to the one they were assigned at birth. It's very possible that the women and non-cisgender people are overrepresented among the survey participants because they felt more concerned to answer. They felt more concerned by the research topic. Nevertheless, it shows that women remain largely underrepresented if we compare to the 51% proportion of women in the general population. We also have among the respondents 76% of heterosexual people and 24% are non-heterosexual, so they identify as queer, bisexual, pansexual, asexual, demisexual, etc. And they might also be overrepresented in the sample because the fact that they were more compelled by the subject of the research. As for racialized people, we have 87% are non-racialized and 13% are racialized. In our research, we asked people for their origins. So we didn't ask them if they identify as non-racialized and racialized. So we had a bit of a problem to determine who we would put in the category racialized, but we ended up deciding that it would be people with only non-Caucasian origins, even though it's not perfect way to describe it. We had to decide how to fix this problem. We have 3% of our sample who are disabled people and who has disability that might influence their colleagues' perception of them. And all these percentage that I just mentioned, we cannot use these numbers to establish the proportion of men, women, non-cisgender people, non-heterosexual people, racialized people in the gaming industry and in Quebec gaming industry, because, as I said, they might be overrepresented. But what's interesting is that we got so many respondents to the survey. 1,500 is a very great number. So when we compare these categories together, we have very strong results that we can generalize to the studied population. However, for some questions, and I will specify it, the number of people in the category, for example, the number of non-cisgender people or disabled people are not enough to make statistically significant results. So I will mention it when it's the case. What is interesting when it comes to intersectionality is that a higher proportion of women and non-cisgender people face other factors of discrimination, such as being non-heterosexual, racialized, or disabled. And the average man is slightly higher than the average age of women and non-cisgender people. So this might be an indication that women and non-cisgender people are in the past years were in higher proportion entered in the video game industry. One of the most worrying findings of the research is that the proportion of people with a mental illness is twice higher among women and 4 times higher among non-cisgender people than men. Although the methodology adopted, the survey cannot allow us to infer a causal relationship between being marginalized and having a mental health, we can maybe suppose that there are some influence between these two variables in some cases. A testimony of one of our respondents shows that mental health problems tend to be ignored and remain taboos in some studios. Jean-Christophe says, you cannot go on sick leave in this kind of company if you want to keep your job. It is seen more as a weakness than anything else. It is not well perceived. As for vertical segregation, the proportion of men and women in the top management is similar, but non-cisgender people are absent from the top management. The proportion of men in a director position is twice higher than the proportion of women, but there are no significant differences for the position of leads. So this data might indicate that the glass ceiling for women is at the level of director. In the case of the game industry, the proportion of men in senior position is significantly higher than the proportion of women and non-binary people, possibly because of the years of experience in the industry. It's hard to know. And the data does not indicate any significant differences in hierarchical levels between racialized and non-racialized people. A slightly lower proportion of women and a significantly lower proportion of non-cisgender people than the proportion of men are very confident to be able to move up the ladder. And a significantly lower proportion of racialized people are very much moderately or little confident to be able to move up the ladder. The glass ceiling or sticky floor phenomenon, according to which people from a certain marginalized group have difficulty to move up the ladder in a company despite their skills and experiences, still exist in the video game industry, but perhaps not as dramatically as might one have imagined. As for horizontal segregation, when we look at the sectors in which men, women, and non-cisgender people work, we see that there's an important horizontal segregation. The proportion of men in the IT sector, for example, which include programming, engineering, and technical support, is significantly higher than the proportion of women and cisgender people. And the proportion of women in the arts sector, which includes graphic design, music, animation, and script writing, is significantly higher than the proportion of men and non-cisgender people. And the proportion of non-cisgender people in the quality assurance, which is the playtesting sector, the sector where when players test the games for bugs or just for reports, filling reports. So they are non-cisgender people are significantly higher in higher proportion in this sector, which is one of the sector that has the most precarious job and the most part-time and low salaries job actually in the game industry. The data does not indicate any significant difference on this aspect between racialized and non-racialized people. As for the entry door in the industry, the entry door are very different according to gender category. A higher proportion of women were recruited by a headhunter. That indicates, it's a bit encouraging because it seems to indicate that the studio manager are actively trying to recruit women. And a higher proportion of non-cisgender people entered via the quality assurance sector. Again, playtesting the game, reporting the bugs, which is a video game industry sector which has the lowest barrier to entry. It's not very difficult to enter as a playtester. You can just basically answer to a call, and you might not even have to be interviewed. You get the job more easily. It's like that in Quebec, at least. And a lower proportion of non-cisgender people entered with an interview in the game industry. So this might be due to unconscious biases, which can lead manager to select candidates who look like them or fit the role of the gamer or the geek in this case, which gamer and the geek are still associated to men and masculinity in our society. And unconscious biases are actually linked to a phenomenon described by Ashcraft as the glass slipper metaphor, which is inspired by this fairy tale of Cinderella that you probably all know about, this poor and abused young girl who's found by a charming prince thanks to the glass slipper she dropped one night when they met, and into which only her foot fits perfectly. So this metaphor kind of illustrates how occupations come to appear by their very nature to possess central, enduring, and distinctive characteristics that make them suitable for some people and not plausible for others. So like other metaphors, such as the glass ceiling, the glass slipper exposes systemic forms of discrimination, in this case related to the association of certain professions to specific social identities. However, according to the collected data, there's no significant differences in recruitment methods for racialized people compared to non-racialized people. The wage inequality is actually one of the most shocking data that we collected. Men make much better salaries than women and non-cisgender people, especially when it comes to high salaries. The proportion of non-cisgender people making less than 40,000 Canadian dollars per year is almost double than the proportion of men, probably because they work in higher proportion in the quality assurance department. The proportion of women making less than 45,000 a year is also significantly higher. So this means that they actually have more precarious part-time jobs. The majority of the employees at Quebec gaming industry make between $46,000 and $105,000 per year. And there's no significant gender difference in this bracket. However, the higher are the salaries, the wider is the gender pay gap between men, women, and non-cisgender people. So the proportion of men who make salaries between $100,000 and $135,000 per year is twice higher as the proportion of women and 5 times higher than the proportion of non-cisgendered people. And when it comes to salary over $136,000 a year, it's 5 times higher. So here, it's one case where even there's 6% of non-cisgender people in this category. The difference is not statistically significant due to the very small number of people who ended up in this category. We verified we tried to understand this because it seemed very hard, especially in Quebec, where it's a society where people say that equality between men and women is already reached. But obviously, when we look at these numbers, it's not. And so we try to verify if the differences in the wage could be explained by the differences in the years of the number of years of experience. It turns out that the proportion of women with 8 years of experience or more who make more than $106,000 a year is still significantly lower than the proportion of men. And the proportion of women with 8 years or more of experience who make more than $136,000 a year is 4 times lower than the proportion of men. So we try to verify if this wage gap could be due to the fact that women and non-cisgender people do not access to management position. However, we found out that the proportion of women in such position who are making more than $106,000 a year is twice lower than the proportion of men. And when it comes to salary of $136,000 a year, it's 4 times lower than the proportion of men, even when they are in management position. And this cannot be explained either by the university degree, which is pretty similar from one gender category to another. And it cannot either be explained by having a degree in a program related to video games, which is pretty similar too. So in addition of systemic discrimination in the wage allocation system, the gender pay gap can possibly be explained by the fact that employees often have to negotiate their wage in the game industry. And the fact that only 45% of the studios have a policy on pay equity. And also a significantly lower proportion of women and non-cisgender people are very much willing to negotiate their wage. So this culture of attribution, of salary attribution, is at the disadvantage of women and non-cisgender people. And there's also, according to Xavier's testimony, some sort of law of silence about employees' wage in some studios. Employees seems discouraged from talking about their salary and comparing it with other colleagues. Xavier says, and I quote, "We were having a drink and talking about wages, and then it came to someone's ears." And the rest of the testimony says that it shouldn't have been done. Let's talk a bit about what I call solo status. So the proportion of women and non-cisgender people who found themselves alone or almost alone in their gender in a team is 5 times higher than the proportion of men. This is what we call the solo status, being alone or almost alone of our category in a group. And interestingly, 41% of women and 66% of non-cisgender people who were in this situation felt uncomfortable. And according to a theory on the solo status, this situation may give the impression of being used as a token. That's meaning being hired to make the company look inclusive rather than for skills, for example. And the solo status is also related to a phenomenon called stereotype threat, which is the pressure that someone feels to avoid reinforcing negative stereotypes about his or her category, and that can lead to continuous efforts, including self-censorship. So the mobilization of mental resources and self-censorship may negatively affect this person and may affect this person's performance at work. Solo status is also linked to the impostor syndrome, which is this tendency of a person to underestimate his or her performance, to believe that he or she does not deserve his or her place in a given environment, or that his or her successes are due to chance rather than his or her abilities. And so this syndrome often comes along with lack of self-confidence, anxiety, and frustration. That said, the data collected with the survey shows that only the proportion of non-cisgender people who feel very much that they belong in the work environment, and the proportion of racialized people who feel very much like they belong in their environments is significantly lower than the proportion of men. In other words, women seems to feel that they belong in their work environment as much as men, but non-cisgender people and racialized people much less. For non-cisgender people, it could be explained by the fact that a bigger proportion of them work in the quality insurance sector. And as Agat's testimonies shows, this sector tend to be segregated from the development team. Agat says, and I quote, "The QAs are not treated equally than those who work on the games. You cannot talk too much with the developers. The Christmas party was separated as well." Unlike what the past media coverage of the gaming industry suggests, the majority of women and non-cisgender people are comfortable in the working environment. However, the differences between the level of comfort of men on the one hand and the level of comfort of women and non-cisgender people on the other hand is notable. A significantly greater proportion of men can very much share their ideas without being judged. A larger proportion of women and non-cisgender people feel very much the need to prove themselves. A smaller proportion of non-cisgender people feel that they have the recognition they deserve. And a proportion twice greater of women and 3 times greater of non-cisgender people feel very much the need to change to adapt to their environment. As for their level of satisfaction, contrary to what the past year's media coverage suggests, the majority of women and non-cisgender people are satisfied with their working conditions. However, the differences between the level of satisfaction of men on the one hand and the level of satisfaction of women and non-cisgender people on the other end is significant. A lower proportion of non-cisgender people is very much satisfied with the workload, with the distribution task, and the salary, perhaps because there are in a higher proportion working in this precarious sector of quality assurance. It is surprising that there's not a bigger gap between men and women satisfaction about their salary, considering the gender pay gap mentioned earlier. A smaller proportion of non-cisgender people are very much satisfied with the respect of their supervisor, of the respect of their colleagues, and of the support they have from their supervisor when problems arise. And this is unfortunate considering that there's a higher proportion rate of mental illness among non-cisgender people, and considering that social support provides access to psychological and material resources that improve an individual's ability to cope with stress. Non-cisgender people are also in lower proportion satisfied with the values conveyed by the game on which they work. As for racialized people, the only difference with non-racialized people when it comes to the satisfaction with different aspects of their job is in regard with the salary. And we see that they're less very satisfied. A higher proportion of women and non-cisgender people experience different forms of discrimination. The proportion of women who are often treated differently is 4 times greater than the proportion of men, and the proportion of non-cisgender people 3 times greater. Proportion of women who are often assigned subordinate tasks is twice greater than the proportion of men. And Alexandra's testimonies actually show what form these tasks can take. She says, and I quote, "I already had a lot of tasks to do, and when this manager arrived, he asked me to perform secretarial tasks. He was asking me to create his meeting, to edit his meeting, to postpone his video conferences, in short, assistant task." And she was a senior. The proportion of women who are often excluded from discussions is twice higher than the proportion of men. And Lucy's testimony helped to understand how this exclusion can manifest itself. She says, and I quote, "Everyone was invited to the meetings except me. So I would see them all go into a room. I was the only woman. He would tell me, 'You're not invited.'" The proportion of women and non-cisgender people who are often interrupted is 3 times higher than the proportion of men. And testimonies from women interviewees illustrate how women are not listened to and how their opinion is often ignored. Palga, for example, says, "Once I said something and the director did not listen to me at all. Then my colleague had to explain the same thing again for him to understand I really didn't like that." And Alice says, and I quote, "We are just women on the project in the art department. We raised concern about how things were done in the game, and this person in a position of authority kind of ignored our opinion. It's frustrating." Alice's testimonies also evoke the idea that women are not socialized to speak as often and as loudly as men. She says, and I quote, "In design, there are men who have loud mouths, who speaks a lot, who loudly and for a long time. I'm under the impression that women do not dare to speak loudly and for a long time, and it can be more difficult because of that. We are not encouraged to speak like that." Considering all this, it's not surprising that the proportion of women who feel very much vulnerable to discrimination is 5 times higher than the proportion of men, and the proportion of non-cisgender people 3 times higher. Marie-Pierre's testimony illustrates how discrimination can take place during the hiring process. She says, and I quote, "When I was interviewed by the supervisor and the boss at the company, I was doing well until he asked me if I was pregnant or if I wanted children. That was the only time in my career when I felt that I probably worked less than a male candidate." And this is quite shocking, considering that 67% of the studios have a policy on discrimination, which is not enough. About sexism, women and non-cisgender people are also experiencing different forms of sexism, but more often what we call ordinary sexism. Unlike hostile sexism, which refers to explicit expressions of contempt for women, ordinary sexism refers to subtle gender stereotypes and discrimination that permeate everyday life and that are normalized or masked with humor, for example. So the proportion of women whose contribution are often minimized is twice greater than the proportion of men. The same can be said for the proportion of women whose colleagues often take for granted that they do not want more responsibilities, or often doubt their competences, and the proportion of non-cisgender people whose competence or question is even higher. Alice's testimonies explain how these doubts can be expressed. She says, and I quote, When I was in quality assurance, after 3 months, I was in charge of testing everything related to connectivity. It was really complicated. A lead from another mobile team was surprised that I was able to explain it. There is an expectation that women have less advanced technical skills than men. And just like Alice, Emma links these doubts to her gender. She says, I have a problem with the perception that people might have of me, thinking that I'm not competent, for example, as I am a woman in video games. So this echoes a phenomenon that is actually well documented and is called technomasculinity, which is in short the association between masculinity, technology, and advanced technological skills. Women and non-cisgender people also experience benevolent sexism, which is caring but paternalistic and infantilizing behaviors towards women based on a positive perception of women as gentle and warm, a belief in the complementary of the sexes and in the need to maintain cordial relationship between men and women, and a chivalrous idea that men should protect women because they are vulnerable. So for instance, the proportion of women and non-cisgender people who often have subject on which they have an expertise explained to them in a condescending way, which is a phenomenon called mansplaining, is more than twice greater than the proportion of men. And the proportion of women and non-cisgender people who are often offered help without having asked for it, a phenomenon that is called white knighting, is 5 times higher than the proportion of men. The data collected does not reveal any significant differences between the experience of racialized and non-racialized people with regard to sexism. As you probably all know, the gaming industry is notorious for its crunch culture, and the majority of the respondents consider that it's important to work overtime in order to advance a career in the gaming industry. Interviewees' testimony helped to better understand this crunch culture and the fact that overtime is not imposed by force, but strongly motivated by colleagues and supervisors' comments and behaviors. Mac, for example, says, you do not usually get paid for your extra time or compensated with holidays. It is just time out of your own time, and the team, your boss, the other people who did it will make you feel bad for not doing it. Xavier says, my girlfriend was doing 70 to 80 hours a week as a project manager, and when she went down to 50 hours, she was paid for 37. The VP of the company asked her if she still liked her job. So women and non-cisgender people are as willing as men to work overtime, but as Emma's testimony showed, that she shows, crunching can have different impact on employees' life depending on their personal situation. She says, and I quote, at the time I was pushing myself to produce the same amount of work and attendance as anyone else, so I would not be seen as underperforming. So obviously it definitely hurt my children. Psychological harassment. About half of the respondents said that they have experienced problems related to psychological harassment by superior, but most often by colleagues. A larger proportion of women and non-cisgender people were often, sometimes, or rarely belittled by a colleague or a superior. A larger proportion of women and non-cisgender people were often, sometimes, or rarely humiliated by a colleague or by, but there's no significant difference for being humiliated by a superior. Larger proportion of women were often, sometimes, or rarely ignored by a colleague. And there's no significant difference for being ignored by a supervisor. And a larger proportion of women were often, sometimes, or rarely threatened by a colleague or by a superior. Finally, a larger proportion of women were often, sometimes, or rarely threatened by a colleague or by a supervisor. So Alice's testimonies illustrate how psychological harassment can be made and the impact that it can have on someone's career. She says, from the moment my manager destroyed all my work and my skills, I became a little apprehensive about starting again in another company. When I go for interviews, I have butterflies in my stomach and I fear to encounter similar people. The level of psychological harassment is surprising, considering that 63% of the studios have a policy on psychological harassment. And as for racialized people, the only significant difference when it comes to psychological harassment is that the proportion of racialized people who were often treated with hostility by a superior is 4 times higher than the proportion of non-racialized people. But because of the small percentage of people concerned here, it is not the most relevant statistic. Sexual harassment. We heard a lot about it in the media, so let's see what the numbers are saying. Even after the Me Too movement and the equivalent of this movement in the game industry, sexual harassment remains an important issue. 38% of women and 24% of non-cisgender people have often, sometimes, or rarely received unsolicited advance from colleagues, which is 4 times more than the proportion of men. 12% of women and 10% of non-cisgender people have often, sometimes, or rarely received unsolicited advance from a superior, which is 6 times more than the proportion of men. And 38% of women and 34% of non-cisgender people have often, sometimes, or rarely received comments on their appearance from a colleague, which is 3 times more than the proportion of men. 70% of women and 19% of non-cisgender people have often, sometimes, or rarely received comments on their appearance from a superior, which is twice the proportion of men, a little more than twice. 19% of women and 11% of non-cisgender people have often, sometimes, or rarely received comments or sexual messages from a colleague, which is 3 times more than the proportion of men. And 6% of women and 3% of non-cisgender people have often, sometimes, or rarely received sexual messages from a superior, which is 6 times more than the proportion of men. 17% of women often, sometimes, or rarely were touched inappropriately by a colleague, which is 4 times more than the proportion of men. And 7% of the women were often, sometimes, or rarely touched inappropriately by a supervisor, which is 3 times higher than the proportion of men. 5% of women often, sometimes, or rarely had sexual intimacy imposed on them by a colleague, which is 5 times higher than the proportion of men. And 2% of women and non-cisgender people had sexual intimacy imposed on them by a superior, which did not happen to any of our men responded. Not surprisingly, 47% of women and 42% of non-cisgender people feel vulnerable to sexual harassment compared to 5% of men. And the data collected does not reveal any significant differences between the experience of racialized and non-racialized people with regard to sexual harassment. Nevertheless, racialized people feel significantly more at risk of sexual harassment than Caucasian non-racialized people. Testimonies from women interviewees help to understand how sexual harassment can be perpetrated in studios. Alice says, and I quote, "On Instagram and Snapchat, he did not let go of me, even at the Christmas party. I'm a very sociable person, but at some point you have to get the signal that I'm sending." And Marie-Pierre says, "I have been in situations where men ask me and I say no, but the situation continues. You do not really know how to say no anymore. There was one case that went really far. It went on for a year on a daily basis. A man waited for me to leave every evening to follow me." And actually, Marie-Pierre ended up changing jobs, even if she would have preferred not to. So there was a severe impact on her career. In the literature, informalism is often mentioned to explain this phenomenon. Informalism is described as this generally relaxed nature of employees and their interactions that can lead to some abusing it and embarrassing their colleagues, being too comfortable with a type of humor or choice of topic or of conversation in the workplace can lead to slippage. Nonetheless, the level of sexual harassment is surprising, considering that 70% of the studios have a policy on sexual harassment. And this might explain why women and non-cisgender people do not trust the complaint system of their company. So a much bigger proportion of men are very much confident to be able to denounce appropriate behavior without being seen as a spoil sport, or to be able to file a complaint without suffering prejudice. Two of our interviewees' testimonies help to understand what kind of prejudice an employee can suffer from after filing a complaint. Alice says, and I quote, "My manager at the time said to me, 'You spoke to HR about it? That's a big mistake. If I was your colleague, I would be even worse with you. Withdraw your complaint.' And she says, 'It scared me. I cried and I withdrew my complaint.'" Robert says HR announced that they received complaints, and then on the floor, it was understood that we could not have more fun. There were clearly people saying out loud around me, "Who spoke?" Denunciation was punished. So there seems to be a law of silence or implicit code that discourage employees from reporting harassment by instilling fear of isolation or retaliation. A significantly higher proportion of men are very much confident that no one gets a free pass when it comes to harassment complaints, and that adequate sanctions are applied to punish those with inappropriate behavior. This is clearly not the opinion of Luc, who says, "It's the open secret of the video game industry. Human resources are not there to protect the employees." There is also a discrepancy in the trust in the system between racialized and non-racialized people. A significantly higher proportion of non-racialized people are very much moderately or little confident to be able to denounce without being seen as spoil sport. I meant lower proportion. And a lower proportion of them are able to file a complaint without suffering prejudice. A significantly higher proportion of non-racialized people are very much moderately or a little confident that no one gets a free pass, and that the adequate sanctions are applied. So in conclusion, what we should remember of all this, there's a lot of data, right? But the first thing I like people to remember is that the situation of women and non-cisgender people is less dramatic than what the past year's media coverage led us believe, because the majority of them, if we look at the numbers, did not often experience discrimination, sexism, and harassment. In other words, it's not a fatality that as a woman or racialized people or non-cisgender people working in the industry, it's not a fatality that we would experiment inequality, discrimination, or sexism or harassment. However, women and non-cisgender people are significantly less comfortable, less satisfied, less confident in the complaint system than men. And there are still very strong structural obstacles to diversity, equality, and inclusion that persist, such as vertical segregation, horizontal segregation, wage inequality, ordinary and benevolent sexism, and psychological and sexual harassment.